Today's scripture reading may be found in Mark chapter 8, verses 31 through 38, and they read. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Whew, Peter just got a talking to. And it comes as a bit of a surprise. After all, Peter had been previously on a roll. These words come immediately after Peter has named Jesus as the Christ. In fact, he gets the exact right answer. He says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." In other words, the Messiah who would bring an end to the realm and the ways of evil empires and usher Israel into a new realm of peace and prosperity. Good things are about to come. The disciples just know it. They can feel it in their bones. And then Jesus, seemingly out of the blue, says that he is going to face rejection, be killed, that he would suffer before then. This comes as a shock, as cold water, certainly a curveball to say the least. And this is the first time that Jesus has spoken of his suffering or his death. Up until now, the narrative has been a highlight reel of Jesus' exploits, his showing his power and his authority and glory, healing miracles, casting out demons, wise words. So if Jesus had not said these words, one might have thought that the good times were meant to last forever. Jesus' words must have seemed as if one were slamming on the brakes of a train seemingly bound for, destined for glory, something amazing. Now, he says these words, "I will suffer, be rejected, and die." Now, he did say that he would defeat death in 3 days, but apparently those words were lost on Peter amidst all the rest of everything else. Perhaps he was too stunned by what he heard to hear the punchline, which was that he would rise from the dead in 3 days. So Peter just can't believe it. He is having none of it. He pulls Jesus aside, and Jesus had said these words openly. Now Peter wants to manage the message in private. He wants to reprimand Jesus as if he is speaking out of line. So he pulls Jesus aside and rebukes him. And it is after this rebuke that Jesus speaks loud enough for everyone else to hear, brings the crowd back into the conversation. "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." And I just gotta say, harsh words. To be called Satan, imagine it. Now, you may recall that this word in the Hebrew most often serves as a verb, a descriptor of an action or something happening to someone, and it means tempter or adversary. But by the time Jesus was around, Satan had come to be viewed not only as a verb, but began to serve as a noun, as some form of embodied evil. So I cannot imagine how Peter may have felt. But Jesus chose that word on purpose to name a truly demonic thought. Even the word rebuke to describe how Peter first speaks to Jesus and how Jesus responds to Peter points us towards just how important it is for Jesus to correct this way of thinking. Apparently, there's a lot left on the line after Peter's rebuke of Jesus. So all this to say, Jesus' rebuke is a big-time rebuke meant for a serious error. This error is described by some as glory-only theology. Glory-only theology is a theology that assumes that to walk as a disciple or a faithful person is to walk a steady path toward our own crown with no struggle in the time in between. Jesus names this line of thought, that we will not suffer or that he would not suffer, as demonic. He names it as demonic because he sees great danger in it. For if God's people only see their calling as a calling toward greatness, security, safety, and happiness, then when the time comes to take great risks, God's people will be caught off guard and unprepared. And those times will come. They do come. They always have. When the time comes to march for the cause of justice, Christians will make every excuse. When the time comes to struggle through some social change, Christians will say, I didn't sign up for this. When the time comes to take unpopular positions on the war economy, capitalistic greed, and our racist institutions, we will shy away from naming these evils because we always thought we were destined for glory, only glory, safety, and positions of strength. So I gotta say, for all of us, get behind us, Satan, for we do not always have in mind the things of God, but often the things that are all too human. Now, before we move on, I should make another point. The purpose of such suffering is not the suffering itself. We should avoid suffering when we can. We should not seek it out for its own sake. I feel almost embarrassed to have to say this, but some people seem to think that the religious life is one marked with suffering because God's people are gluttons for punishment. Not so, says Micah Keel. He writes, Jesus does not suffer and die because suffering is good. The necessity of the suffering comes from the way Jesus lives, a series of actions that pay no heed to social and religious norms. A life that reaches out to those who are ostracized, unclean, or marginalized. In other words, when we suffer for the outcasts or for a greater good. We don't suffer just because we like to suffer. Avoid it when you can. The reality is, to get from where we are to where we need to be, that way will be very hard. Jesus' life reveals this. Jesus knew this and saw that his path bending toward a cross in the holy city of Jerusalem would be hard. Bruce Epperly writes of this, the cross is on the horizon. Although Jesus had choices and can choose to bypass Jerusalem, his destiny calls him forward, risking death to be true to God. We too must take risks to be faithful. This is a hard path, in part because we do our best to manage risk and to assess cost and benefit. We want to avoid physical and emotional pain whenever possible. Often, others' sorrows are simply too much to bear. Followers of Jesus, however, must be willing to embrace suffering for the greater good of others and to follow God's call. What else can it mean? My words, end quote. What else can it mean to take up our cross and to follow Jesus? The cross, an instrument of execution, of torture. So are you, like Peter, surprised or uncomfortable at the call of Jesus? Confessedly, sometimes oftentimes, all the time, I have found it to be so surprising and uncomfortable. But we should not be surprised because Jesus told us that it would be this way long ago when he said, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. And as I more than have alluded to, that doesn't sound fun at all. So why bother? Why forsake the lure of safety and transient glory for some possible better future? Jesus says, my paraphrase, because your very life depends upon it. You sacrifice to save your life. Well, here's how Jesus put it, reading from verse 35 of chapter 8. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Or other translations read, and lose their soul, their essence, what matters most to them. In short, who they really are. You lose it in the name of safety and security if that's all you seek. And Jesus said this at a time when people were grasping for their very lives. That is to say, they were trying to find some solid ground to walk on. Some adapted to and adopted to the way of the Roman Empire in those days. Herod, King Herod, and some of the religious class seemed to fare quite well after adopting this approach. They had found life. Not so, says Jesus. They may have gained the world, but in the process they had become so ethically and morally compromised that they had lost their souls. Biblical scholar Dr. Ron Allen writes, the Gospel of Mark presents the death of Jesus as the collusion of two old age power structures. Some leaders who operate under the aegis of the rulers, values, and practices of the old age and the Roman Empire, which is the epitome of the broken old world, the realm of God, as announced by Jesus, is the ultimate threat to the powers of the old creation. Because the great change, the apocalypse, will replace their domains with the values, behaviors, and ecological realities of the realm. In order to end this threat, the rulers of the old world do the worst they can do, their ultimate exercise of power, by putting Jesus to death. And indeed, when the sun sets on Good Friday and Jesus' body is in the tomb, they appear to have won. But here's the thing, what you should already know. They did not win. Easter brought new life, and we are still talking about it today, thousands of years later. But new evils still try to snuff this life out that we have found. The words of this passage, Jesus' warning, is dire, but as important today as it ever has been. He warns that those who are not on the right side of history, the side of life, those who lose their souls for the sake of some ill-gotten gain, or security or safety even, you lose it all. They do not taste and see the goodness of God's realm. They do not find what happens when things on earth are as they are in heaven. They miss the joy of living a life of principle and integrity. We should not sell out for the brights and shines of this world, for it leaves our spirits empty and our hearts hollow shells. So what about today? How do these dynamics still play out? I think they're cyclical through every generation and every century. But who nowadays preserves their lives for the status quo and who loses their lives to save them? I'll give two examples, two well-known examples, fairly recent, although, 60, 70 years old now. One, Alabama Governor George Wallace, who famously said, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Here is a fuller reading of that quote. He said, "Let us rise to the call for freedom-loving blood that is in us and send our answer to the tyranny that clanks its chains upon the South. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny. And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever." He is also known for such gems as, why does the Air Force need expensive new bombers? Have the people we've been bombing over the years been complaining? And if any demonstrator ever lays down in front of my car, it'll be the last car he'll ever lay down in front of. The former governor of Alabama, people, and one-time presidential candidate, and how those last words about running someone down with their car ring ominous in today's age where Heather Heyer was run down by her car, by a car. So who would you rather have been? George Wallace, who lived to the ripe old age of 79, or Martin Luther King Jr., who was gunned down in his 39th year? Wallace lived 40 years longer than King. There's wisdom in that. And in his day, he had some things going on, you should know. As I said, he was governor of a state, ran for president. The important thing was, he kept his life. Shouldn't we all? Or did he? Eventually, he would. He would later say in an address to King's Old Church in Montgomery, imagine, in King's Old Church, he said, "I have learned what suffering means. In a way that was impossible, I think I can understand something of the pain black people have come to endure. I know I contributed to that pain, and I can only ask your forgiveness." Now, whether or not he really understood the suffering, it seems that he eventually would find his way to life, some form of it. God is his judge. But my point is, why wait? And many never find it. In the meantime, think of the years wasted, the suffering he caused. Why not start along the sometimes dangerous path to life today? We are disciples, so Jesus points the way. And this is why King was shot in Memphis, Tennessee for his protestation of racist systems, the war economy, and poor working conditions. Yet he is resurrected, and his life still speaks. We're talking about him even today. This is why martyrs of old, fighting on the right side of issues, still inspire, even if they did not live to see the realm of God come alive in real time as they had hoped, or even if they only tasted in part what they would later find in whole, even if they did not live to see the change they so passionately pined for, yet they resurrect. Their lives still speak. Or in the words of Maya Angelou, "And still I rise." And still they rise. It's the ghost of old Tom Joad. And if Jesus' resurrection is to be believed, the ghost is no ghost at all, but a flesh and blood body. But it will cost you. There are many moments in history when pockets of calm and comfortable living intersect with the cross we ought to bear. Today, there are many crosses to carry, perhaps more than we know what to do with, and carrying them will certainly threaten our comfort, our safety, and maybe even our lives. But if we are to believe Jesus, this way leads to life in the only sense that really matters. We must rebuke the tempter in us, as Jesus rebuked the tempter in Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan. Get behind me, thoughts of cowardice and complacency." Get behind me. Let us have in mind the things of God and not the things of humankind. If we do, we will find life and have it to the full, said Jesus. Do we have the guts to believe him? But in the meantime, we have a cross to bear for the life of the world. The way of Jesus leads us first to this. But those who walk this way find life, the very reason we were made. So let's walk this path. Let's walk alongside one another in this dangerous, beautiful life. And the good news is, we don't have to do it alone. Let's walk the dangerous path. Live the dangerous life for the sake of love. And let's walk that path together.